love the contrast on the one hand of this sort of hyper-transactional, fairly fast-paced dimension to the auction world, but the contrast with the I guess the kind of exquisite things that are being traded in that way, and that dichotomy is something that's fascinated me ever since and been kind of a big part of my career.
This is The Bigger Picture, an inside look at the businesses that make the art world work and the stories behind the people that shape them. This show is brought to you by Arcata, the leading due diligence network specifically built for the art market and trusted by over 450 members. To understand how Arcata can help you comply and succeed with challenging regulations, go to arcata.com. Today we are joined by Chris Bentley, Head of Fine Art Specie at Excel's UK and Lloyds business. So thanks for joining us today, Chris. I'm going to start off with a question I always ask guests, which is what first drew you to the art world, whether it's something you always had in mind or something that crept up on you?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question because it was a long, long time ago. I mean, I feel like I've always been drawn to the art world. I always wanted to work there, even when I was still at school. But it's been hard to try and remember exactly why. I guess I grew up in a very arty family, but that, you know, the relationship with art was more of a practical one. They were very kind of crafty. They sort of went and painted watercolors every Thursday in a forest. And there was a lot of people doing art around me, but it was, I guess, only peripherally academic and certainly nothing to do with the kind of commercial art world, contemporary world that we know so much about today. I guess as a child, I was aware of this other art world that was very different from the art world that my mother and aunt sort of occupied. And I sort of saw that art world as something kind of mysterious and glamorous and attractive, probably also a bit intimidating, like a kind of club that you're not a member of. And I wanted to feel like I had access to that space. I studied history of art at A-level. Obviously went on to do it at university, and my sort of initial relationship with it was very academic. In the end, I've ended up having a job that gives me this sort of strange bird's eye view, kind of very broad viewpoint of that art world. But otherwise, I'm sort of like others, kind of hanging around the edges, making a nuisance of myself.
I think that's a great description of all of us working in the art world. And you went to UCL. I also went there. Excellent choice. As you say, that was more, it was academic, obviously, but that's from pure passion of art, wanting to spend time with art, learning about it, not thinking at that point, and then I'm going to take it into this profession, XYZ.
Yeah, I guess I did want a career in art when I started my degree, but I hadn't really worked out what that was going to be, at least at the start. That you are, you know, when you study things, you are obviously very academically focused. I think probably the thing I thought I might be in retrospect was an art journalist, because we were spending our time looking at art and trying to write about it sensibly.
Terrible idea.
Yeah. So I think that's probably where, even if it hadn't kind of crystallized in my mind, I think that's probably the way I was thinking. But by the time I started my degree, I'd already had some experience working at Bonhams as a porter. And I'd sort of, if I'd learned anything there, I learned a hell of a lot of things, but I'd learned that I probably wouldn't be able to afford to live in London off the wages that an auction house pays at an entry-level role. And it had been a fantastic experience, but that got me sort of thinking, well, if I'm not going to go into an auction sort of job, if I'm not going to end up in that world, you know, what is available to me? And that's kind of what led me ultimately down an insurance path, is understanding that I was going to need to do something that could sort of earn me enough money to have me live in central London from a relatively sort of early point in my career. And that seemed like a really sensible route to go down.
Can you describe what a porter role is? Because I'm thinking it must be quite logistical, quite operational. It must give you quite a good idea of handling artworks and all the things that insurance is going to later entail, right?
Yeah, and that you know, at the time, obviously, I had no idea that it would inform my sort of future career in that way. But yeah, it's very the relationship you have with art as a porter is extremely kind of physical. You're spending your days really lugging the stuff around, kind of pinning it to the wall, putting it on a plinth, trying to fix something on the lift.
Yeah. It was out of uni, and then I was handling a Magritte. I would be sweating.
I remember, so I didn't ever get to hold anything quite as exciting as a Magritte, but I did have a Stubbs once. I was holding a George Stubbs, and that was very, very exciting. We were obviously kind of occasionally told that this particular thing needed to be taken much greater care of than some of the other things, but accidents happened. I can tell you two very quick stories where I remember being the clocks and watches department was in the basement, and I remember we had to move a whole load of long case clocks sort of up essentially stairs because they wouldn't fit in the lift, and get them displayed in a viewing room. And there was this sort of huge kind of oak, kind of neo-Gothic monstrosity of a long case clock that me and another of the porters were trying to kind of take up the stairs. And I remember ultimately ending up being pinned to the stairs by this long case clock with my knee having
like
gone fretwork on the back of it. So I had to be rescued from that one. I also remember the first time I broke anything, it was a tang horse, so only a few thousand years old. And I'd sort of very carefully taken it off a plinth because I needed to hang something behind. And as I put it on the ground, perhaps I sort of imperceptibly lost my balance, and the sort of legs and base of this thing just turned to dust, which was a kind of slightly horrifying moment for me. Although the sort of Asian art specialist who I had to report my mistake to was incredibly matter of fact and reasonable. He gave me an envelope, told me to get a dustpan and brush, sweep all of the dust and sort of rubble into this envelope. He gave me a crisp £50 note with a post-it note with an address in Westbourne Grove, and sort of sent me straight off to the restorer in a black cab holding this thing. This was about 4 days before the sale. I then went back 3 days later, a day before the sale, collected it back. It looked exactly as it did before I'd caused the damage. And it went on and sold, and no problems. So tang horses are often obviously very heavily restored and have been sort of put back together 100 times before. So that doesn't really affect the value too much. And all's well that ends well.
What a bad day at work.
Yeah, well, but it was fascinating. I think that's, to be entrusted with taking it to the restorer and going and getting it again was a real life-changing experience on some level. And it did sort of that kind of operational sort of nuts and bolts part of the art world, and my exposure to that when I was still a teenager, was very, informed kind of everything that has come for me since.
Did it kind of, because you talked about wanting to be in the club, right? This idea of this mystique around the art world, which is, I think, did it not kind of burst your bubble in terms of making it nuts and bolts?
Yeah, so I guess, yes, on some level, but I think it kind of created a new bubble. So that time at Bonhams was always going to be kind of a great period of my life. I was 18 years old. I was living in London for the first time. It was my first proper job. We were working with great people, and I was getting to sort of be, literally touch and feel all of these kind of really high quality objects. And that was super exciting. But I guess understanding the way that the art market worked and this is kind of more the historical market, again, not the kind of contemporary market of today, but the auction world, understanding how that worked and seeing all the various personalities and the kind of tonal shifts that you'd perceive in an auction room and all of that kind of thing. I mean, it's a different kind of sort of romance, and yes, it's transactional in its nature, but I think I loved the contrast. I loved the contrast on the one hand of this sort of hyper-transactional, fairly fast-paced dimension to the auction world, but the contrast with the I guess the kind of exquisite things that are being traded in that way, and that dichotomy is something that's fascinated me ever since and been kind of a big part of my career.
And also, it was a time, I'm guessing, I can't do my dates properly, but the market was doing quite well in London at that point. There was quite a buoyancy, I think, in my dates around particularly those older markets that might not be as strong nowadays. That sort of excitement in the auction room.
You're absolutely right. So I would say that was probably the last sort of truly golden era for that kind of stuff. There was still a very diverse, kind of well-represented antiques trade in London. That is obviously not the size that it was anymore. Even probably, historical pictures as a market has shrunk in London. But at that time, the middle of the 2000s, we were in a very different place, both politically and economically, from where we are today. There was a lot of, frankly, money in London, and a lot of, a lot of air in the economy. Things were really kind of going well, and that extended into those sale rooms without a shadow of a doubt, and added to, it's most people who've had any experience of auctions know that they can be both extremely exciting and incredibly tedious, depending on what it is being sold and how many lots there are and who's in the room and everything else. But when it was really buzzy, it was a real energy.
And I will move on from the auction answers, but I do miss that moment where you had to be in the room to make a bid, or you'd send someone. I think the whole digital bidding and phones brings a new sort of drama and dynamic, but there was something quite authentic about having to show up with a paddle.
I think so, definitely. And having, there was that obligation also kind of forced people to find ways, creative ways of bidding anonymously, which I think is quite fun. And phone bidding was still definitely like part of the furniture when I was in sale rooms, and I liked that. I think the phone bidding thing was kind of fun because you're watching kind of almost like a competition, aren't you? It's almost like watching a sport, and the sort of jeopardy and the suspense, and especially when you have someone on the phone bidding against someone in the room, it was exciting.
Oh, we just sound like we're reminiscing now. I will move on. Right. You did then spend some time with AXA Insurance, but we're going to come back to that later. Your next kind of role, I guess, was with Aon Artscope. Is that right? That was more insurance. So you're then forming more of a career path for yourself at that point. What was the thinking around that move?
Well, yeah. So I had spent most of the time I was at university working in some shape or other. So I'd had that time at Bonhams. That extended into my first year of university. I was doing mainly just viewings at that point, just invigilating viewings, but on the weekends and stuff. But I got an offer that I'd sort of pursued a little bit, but I managed to get a couple of weeks working for AXA, where I work now, again. I started just sort of doing random office stuff like clearing out their basement and tidying filing cabinets and sort of just generally kind of the sort of office tasks that perhaps were more common in the first decade of the 2000s than they are now.
You did spend a lot of your early career in basements, didn't you?
I did.
AXA.
I did. Yeah, that's why my suntan is so developed as a grown-up. But no, I ended up turning that into a job that sort of saw me through to the end of my second year of university, working part-time in the term time and full-time in the holiday. So I'd had this, by the end of that time at AXA Art, as it was then, I had some kind of basic knowledge of insurance, and it had meant that although I spent the last year of my degree just trying to focus on actually completing said degree with a vaguely decent result and not working, when I finished, it was time to sort of hit the job market, as one does when you finish your studies. I was sort of sure that was something I wanted to explore more of. And having worked for the insurer side of things, I wanted to work for a broker and be that intermediary between the art market and the insurance world. It seemed like a natural thing for me to do because, of course, I'd had experience at that point of both the art world itself and the insurance side of things. So being a middleman between those two worlds felt like a kind of thing I had to explore. So I spent a summer applying for various jobs and ended up working at Aon Artscape, handling actually in the end a book of mainly that traditional London art trade stuff. So it fitted in quite nicely with my Bonhams experience.
If we can just spend a moment on skills, because I think particularly in the art market, historically, but probably more so now, that people's trajectories aren't always linear. Like, people jump across all sorts of roles. So it's more around what sort of skills and knowledge you develop and enjoy. You've obviously come from like an art history there, like an artistic upbringing, art history. How confident do you need to feel on that financial side? Sorry if I'm oversimplifying things, but
no. It's a question that I get asked a lot. I mean, I think to ultimately succeed in the art insurance industry, you will need to have become fluent in both art and finance. But I think it's pretty easy to start with one and acquire the other as you go. There are lots of people working in art insurance today who are very interested in art, but it's not a super majority by any stretch. There are lots of people who work in the art insurance world with almost no interest in art, or at least certainly they started with almost no interest in art, and they come at it in a different way, but it's still in a kind of important way. So we need, as a market, as the art insurance market, I think we need both art and non-art people to sort of make the system work the very best it can. And we need as many sort of clever and motivated people as we can find. London is still the global centre of insurance, just about. Obviously, it's come under increasing global competition over the last few decades. It is still a fantastic industry to work in. Like, I can't overstate how good and fun the insurance market as a whole, with or without the art bit, is to work in. And we've got to continue to attract the best people into those industries. But coming back to your sort of initial question, I think you probably want to come at it with either one or the other, but it's not essential to have both of them when you start up. It's that there are skills that you can acquire as you go along. I knew nothing about insurance when I got my first job. Absolutely nothing. I had no idea. I mean, insurance is one of those things that has a huge amount of jargon, lots of words that you'd never use anywhere else. Everyone talks very fluently in, a completely foreign language. And at the beginning, that, I guess, sort of is intimidating, not least because there are certain words that mean kind of four different things, despite being exactly the same word. But you learn that, you learn that by osmosis. And I think particularly the people who know and love art, who work in the art insurance world, they're just much more naturally able to relate to and talk to the people that they encounter professionally on the client side. And I think, in something as, let's face it, most people don't love reaching into their bank account to pay their insurance premium every year, whether it's for a car or a house or a business or anything else. And I think where people can kind of soften that and like show some interest and have some empathy with a collector or a dealer, we not only can we kind of deliver better services, but we can kind of be better company probably as well. So it's an interesting kind of balance between those two things, being sort of an effective insurance person as well as someone who's genuinely interested in art. There is no blueprint for the kind of how much of each of those things you need in order to be successful. It works in different ways for different people.
And on the back of that, and I'm going to bring this up now when we're discussing like the broker role, because as you say, that's kind of that, you're almost that bridge between the insurance and the art world.
Yeah.
I think for a lot of people, they think of insurance, again, I am making sweeping statements here, it's quite like methodical, quite mathematical, quite objective. The art world, the valuation system, despite many attempts, and it's changing, but valuation has always been to some degree subjective, has this aura around it. Bringing those two things together, obviously part of it's a language thing, making sure each sector understands one another language. But in terms of the actual methodology, valuation must be a really tricky sticking point between those two worlds.
Well, yeah, so, I mean, valuation is kind of the nub of what's interesting or different about art insurance as opposed to, for example, the kind of general contents insurance you have under your household policy. If I sort of look up the price of an ounce of gold on the internet, I will get a specific number, and that will be today's number or this hour's number for an ounce of gold. Whereas that sort of consensus on value doesn't exist for art objects. It's not the same thing. So in many ways, the people who kind of started to think about art insurance as a specific type of insurance decades and decades before, the main problem they were trying to solve is how do we indemnify, i.e. kind of compensate somebody for the loss of an artwork when we don't really have any kind of consensus on what amount of money it would take to do that. And you can't replace artworks generally because they're more often than not unique and therefore irreplaceable. You could potentially replace them with something similar, but that is not what people want in practice. So how do you work out how much money to give somebody when something is lost or damaged? And that is sort of the central kind of question of how you give people insurance for artworks. So the way the market has tended to do that, and this is there are lots of different ways of coping with it, but generally speaking, the process, certainly in the UK insurance market, is that the client will tell you what they want to insure things for, and then you will review and either, amend or accept those values. So it's called agreed value, very straightforward, and it's just it's a way of making sure that everyone, both on the client side and the insurer side, kind of knows how much they're going to get in the event that something goes wrong, which removes that subjectivity of value and kind of replaces it with a pre-agreed objectivity of that value. I mean, that doesn't work in every set of circumstances. Obviously, for people like art dealers who've got stock that is kind of stock list that evolves over time, obviously we can't expect them to get in touch with us and kind of agree values for each and every thing. Again, we are compelled to try and make insurance as low touch as possible so that people are happy to talk to us when they have to. But generally speaking, we think that's the sort of best way of dealing with it. Obviously, what that then does is it puts a huge amount of import on making sure that those values are realistic. So when someone sends us a list, we traditionally we don't directly value anything ourselves because that's not what we're expert in. There are plenty of people out there who, whose primary business it is to value artwork. So the traditional way we deal with this is that clients get their collection valued or provide an opinion themselves if they're so qualified, and they provide that to us, and that's what we review. Obviously, in practice, if you're sent a list of 40,000 objects, am I or any of the other underwriters in my team, or indeed working anywhere in the industry, able to kind of review every single one? Of course, we're not. We have to find ways of sort of verifying the things we need to verify. And what's very interesting is, of course, that technology is going to play more of a role in that than it has done in the past. We are obviously just beginning to see the kind of technology that will help with this kind of really kind of reach the point where it's commercially viable or usable by us. So it's still very much work in progress. But I think what we hope to do is have a much more dynamic relationship with clients in the future about values, so that between us, we are able to make sure that the insurance contract is responding to the value of today, whereas in the past, there would be this inertia between the last time a collection was valued and insurance being pegged to that, even though things might have moved in the meantime. So I think it's it's going to be very interesting and hopefully allow us to kind of create much more dynamic, useful art insurance products in the future. But yeah, the sort of valuation piece is a big area of where things are changing at the moment for us.
And then you moved from that sort of brokering position, I guess, and then you moved into more of the insurance. So you spent some time with Hiscox, and I wanted to talk about one of your other key roles at AXA Art. You became Director of Underwriting for Northern Europe, Middle East and Asia Pacific. My question for that is, obviously that's a much more international role. We've spoken about sort of London's prominence in this generally, but taking on that more international outlook of risk, what did you learn from that? And what did it sort of tell you about the direction art insurance is going to take on a more global perspective?
So that, I mean, it was great, honestly. I sort of remember that period very fondly, not least because I'd had my 3 years at Hiscox, sort of working in the Lloyds building, being at the kind of nub of the international insurance hub that is Lloyds of London. And I think what's possibly not obvious is that the one place in the world where you see insurance business from all over the world is London, whereas other centres of insurance like, New York or Hong Kong or Singapore, they are much more local in their outlook, where London is this only place where you see business from all over the world. And obviously I had seen business from other parts of the world in my time at Hiscox. When I moved to AXA to have the sort of first iteration of the job that I still have today, a good 14 years ago, we were, as a company, looking at how to access those emerging markets, for the first time, honestly. And I think the critical thing to understand is that the interest that people have in buying insurance is very different culturally across the world. So, we obviously in the developed West have this kind of, we think, let's get insurance for that. Whereas that kind of notion just doesn't really exist in the same way in other parts of the world. In Asia, a lot, certainly 20 or 30 years ago, a lot of people just chose not to buy insurance on a private basis. That is changing. In the Middle East as well, even now, very few people buy private insurance. There are religious sensibilities to doing so. It's just not as much of the culture as it is in the West. And I guess what the opportunity was for insurance companies at the beginning of the 21st century and since is that those attitudes were starting to change. And I think the way to probably understand this best is that, of course, the museum world, being ultimately a kind of global network of cultural institutions that lend things to each other, in order for someone to lend something to someone else, they require certain standards. They require a kind of globally observed standard of safety for those artworks, whether that's how they're transported, how they're insured, how they're protected against kind of a change in atmospheric conditions, whatever it is. Those loan agreements are quite prescriptive. So what sort of tends to happen is when a certain part of the world starts to exchange culturally more with the established art world, which was tended to be in the West, they would automatically acquire these standards and start to buy insurance, because even as a private individual, you can say, I don't want to, it's up to me, it's my risk to bear. If you're, a major national museum in London lending to a major national museum in Shanghai, you're going to require the items to be insured. And from that kernel, those insurance markets sort of grew a little bit. So where you have a kind of an evolving sort of institutional, cultural exchange, i.e. public exhibitions, of objects, perhaps not from the country where they're being shown, you would then see sort of a commercial art world sort of kind of appear around that slowly but surely. They would also need to buy commercial insurance in order to be able to get certain things consigned to them for sale. And very sort of slowly those markets grew. And I was really involved in helping those markets develop. We had people locally, initially in Hong Kong and Singapore for Asia, and then latterly in Dubai for the Middle East. And although the Asian business sort of predated me, the Middle Eastern one didn't. And I was kind of very heavily involved in sort of providing the insurance part of that arrangement. So obviously I had people on the ground locally who knew the clients, had those relationships, and they were kind of supported technically by me. And I did the same thing in Asia, albeit that market was more mature by that point anyway. And it was incredibly interesting to sort of see the art world expand in these areas, and to travel to some really great places, particularly in Asia. And be a part of that, which is exciting. And now, things have changed dramatically in terms of where the sort of locus of the art world really is globally. It's a much more diffuse, kind of global map of where interesting things in the art world happen than it was 25 years ago. I was a sort of very small part of that at one point, and that was really interesting.
It's probably a naive question, but you've talked about, that sort of institutional cultural exchange is sort of prompting some of, these standards moving and becoming a bit more consistent. To what extent, when you're working in insurance in a region, perhaps you haven't had sort of been working before, do you need to understand how the art market itself is developing and art collecting itself is developing? Because that doesn't come out the same way in every region. It can be quite distinct.
Totally, like completely. So there's a huge amount of cultural variation in sort of what people collect, how they collect, what they collect for. A good example is like the number of private foundations in Asia. People essentially collect in order to start a foundation, leave that as a legacy. Private museums all over Asia in a way that you just certainly don't see in Europe in the same way I guess you do a little bit in the US. In order for us to be able to take advantage of the growth of those markets, we had to understand how they were growing and via whom they were growing.
And why? Like the motivation for owning and building these collections is going to have insight into their relationship to the works, how they want to protect them. Do you know what I mean? It's going to shift, isn't it?
Completely. And I think what's interesting, and this is probably a sweeping generalization, but the people who were collecting in those emerging markets were certainly, not focused primarily on trading at that point in the way that some Western collectors, particularly latter years, have. This inevitably, I think, collecting in the emerging markets is a lot more to do with culture than the sort of most transactional end of the spectrum of collectors in the West. There are some really complex and sort of culturally interesting kind of details around kind of why people would want to build those collections, not just a financial hedge.
Final question on that, I think. The risks, again, this might be naive because I haven't worked in insurance, but the risks you're looking at in different regions, I'm even thinking like if areas with loads of floods versus the ongoing damp in UK, it's slightly different how you measure those risks, how you're monitoring them, the level of those risks. Like, is it a completely different ballgame as you're working globally? How is it easy to use the same infrastructure modelling in all these different places?
So I guess the sort of headline answer is no. There are lots of differences. There's also a lot of similarities. So I think you could overemphasize how different it is. Like the risks that a painting undergoes are essentially the same. However, obviously, how likely those things are, if you take somewhere like Hong Kong or Singapore, for example, you've just got very high humidity in a way that you wouldn't necessarily have in Western Europe. That, in some cases, needs to be managed in order to protect the artwork. I think probably more compelling in the end, or more relevant, is the infrastructure differences. So we have, in Europe and the US, we have a huge network of restorers with all the various different specialisms. We have fine art specialist loss adjusters who can turn up when something goes wrong relatively quickly with expertise and start to solve those problems. We have a very developed fine art shipping network, which helps kind of transport things safely. There's just a lot of infrastructure, and it's easy to sort of take that for granted or imagine that it exists in the same way in other parts of the world. And this is evolving as well. Certainly that infrastructure is in a different place in both Asia and the Middle East than it was 25 years ago. But that has been work in progress. That's been something that needed to emerge alongside the emerging insurance market or art insurance market in those regions in order to for us to be able to serve properly those people. So at the beginning, that's a massive factor. If I've got if someone has water damage in Shanghai and I can't get a specialist loss adjuster there for 48 hours, then that water damage is going to be much more significant than if we could get someone there sooner. We would not have that problem today, but there was a time when, those problems were a little more common. And of course, that's a massive factor.
And I guess wherever you are in the world, if there's a clumsy 18-year-old porter, you're in trouble anyway, right? Exactly.
And if I learned anything in my Bonhams days, that it was inevitable that there would be. So yeah, stuff gets damaged. Otherwise, we wouldn't have a job. And I guess what's good about the job is that you fix it, and that's satisfying. And without sort of kind of trying to pretend that I sort of do everything for ethical reasons, there is something I feel good ultimately about the fact that I am protecting and preserving cultural objects like that. We are playing a role in that process, and I think that's a good thing.
And just check, I think your current title is Head of Fine Art and Specie, isn't it? Is that your current title?
For the UK region, yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
For non-insurance people, can you explain what that title is? What's like in your remit and how it shifts you from that more international active role?
Sure. So I guess the way to understand fine art and specie is an odd word that no one outside the insurance world has really ever heard. Half of the people in the insurance world probably don't know what it means.
I just think of Natural History Museum. I'm like species,
Species is quite a common route to go down. So specie is like an old-fashioned word for precious metals. And I think rather than being distracted by that, I think the best way of understanding the difference between fine art and specie is that fine art, in an insurance usage, is essentially anything collectible. So anything that you can buy and sell at an auction house is another good way of thinking about it. What this means in practice is not just paintings and sculptures, it's wine, musical instruments.
Luxury assets? I don't want to dip into that whole conversation, but the market generally is dipping.
So certainly jewellery.
High-end, like bespoke.
Well, also jewellery all the way from the sort of mining risk to the retailer, actually.
Oh, okay.
And all of the various stages in between. Jewellery... so we would, confusingly, jewellery is sort of part of specie until it's actually a ring on someone's finger or owned by a private person. Then we sort of treat it more as if it's fine art, because of course you would buy and sell jewellery through an auction house as well. But that more commercial risk is a completely different world, the sort of the jewellery world, the kind of hat and garden sort of infrastructure. We consider that part of the specie world. Specie is basically things that aren't collectible but are of high value and get moved around. So cash, bullion,
watches.
The watch market is part of specie, and then watches on someone's wrist is then considered fine art.
I like how you make it so simple. Insurance. Yep. Okay. Easy.
Fine Art and Specie is really a single market, i.e. the people who are involved in Fine Art and Specie are involved in both of those things and nothing else. So our world does extend beyond just the collectibles, the paintings, the sculptures, into this other world of cash vans and bullion depositories and various other things. So, another way to sort of think of Specie is stuff that is worth spending a lot of time trying to steal.
That's much easier for me. Cool. I like that. And actually, on that note, I'm going to try and get this right because it's quite a long title. You were member of and chairman for a bit of the International Underwriting Association Joint Specie Committee. Did I get that right?
Almost, yeah. So the Joint Specie Committee is called a Joint Specie Committee because it's it sort of groups two associations, the LMA and the IUA, which is the one that you were mentioning. And this will be deeply uninteresting for listeners, so we mustn't go down this rabbit hole. But the Joint Specie Committee is essentially a sort of elected body of specialists in the art and specie insurance market, on the insurer side of things, not the broker side of things.
Okay.
It's a very difficult thing to sort of convey to people without getting too technical, but the insurance market is like a sort of matrix of companies that both compete and collaborate with each other in order to provide insurance. And that's why we're able, as a group of people, to get together once a month in the same room and kind of discuss issues that need to be discussed, whilst also competing with one another. That feels very counterintuitive to people from the outside. And obviously we have to behave like competitors in terms of the rules and everything else. So we're very fastidious about that. But ultimately what we're trying to do is discuss issues in the market, review and develop like market wordings, look at macroeconomic trends that may be about to influence our lives. How do we react to those? As much as anything, sort of basically trying to ensure that the insurance market, or our part of the insurance market, remains capable of responding to the sort of ever-evolving demands of the art world and the specie worlds that we support with our insurance products. So Is
it a bit like a trade association-ish? Like you have one voice on issues, for example, you want to raise with government. It like brings you together, but it's also operational.
Yes.
You're sharing information.
Absolutely. So to the extent that regulators want to ask a question of the industry, for example, or government, then that would often end up being considered by our committee and responded to. But we are also doing some much more sort of operational stuff, like, for example, making sure that our cyber exclusions are up to date in a world where cyber risk changes all the time.
Yeah. Okay. I won't go into detail because I feel like I'll dip into terms of reference and I'll start boring the listeners. So, final question, and we always ask this as well. I get very mixed answers. If you were you or someone starting out, they've just finished their degree or they're thinking about their post-auction house experience move into the art world, what advice would you have for someone that wants a career in the art world generally, not necessarily just insurance?
That's a very, very good question. The thing, I probably preface it with that it's really hard. Like, it's really difficult to get a job.
Motivational, Chris. Yep, brilliant.
It's really hard to get your foot in the door in the art world, but a huge number of people, are very compelled to try. And I think if you can sort of persevere and relentlessly network, whether, any job in the art world will require that, you will normally find a way in eventually. So I think my advice is that at the very beginning of the process is try to have as broad a number of experiences as possible, because there is like 1,000,001 different jobs in the art world, and that's not obvious to people until they sort of get into it. So I would say phase one, try and get as many of those experiences as possible, meet as many people as possible, really get an idea of what you want to do. And then phase two, be much more targeted about what you're going for. Having a sort of idea that you want to work in the art world is probably not precise enough for you to end up kind of making the kind of progress you need to. I think you need to have that, you need to have decided on a very precise role that you want to go for and then relentlessly target that.
I also think just hearing about your experience starting quite early when you're still at university and you're still absorbing all that lovely academic moment, but thinking practically at that point has given you a bit of a lead time to get that experience in.
Massively, like timing is everything. The earlier you can start, the better. Obviously, I sort of every day I am conscious of this. In all honesty, I was very lucky that I worked out really very early kind of what I wanted to do. The later you do, the later you sort of decide on a path forward, the harder it is. And not least because life moves independently of your career, and you get to a certain point in life where, you know, family becomes an issue, sort of, you might find fitting in study more difficult. They're kind of, life gets ever more complicated as we get older. And I think being able to kind of start that process of beginning a career before you're overtaken by other responsibilities is pretty, well, gives you a massive advantage.
Yeah, and as you say, I think the pressure of having to pay your rent in London out of uni often gives you a bit of a kick as well, doesn't it?
It does. Yes, it does. That is the most motivational thing of all, sadly.
Exactly. Well, thank you so much. Honestly, I've really enjoyed that. I feel like I've learnt a lot, and I hope we haven't taken too much of your time today.
You absolutely haven't. It's been great to have the opportunity to try and explain to people that insurance is not boring. It's anything but.
I will make sure I will label the podcast "Insurance is not boring."
It's a wonderful career for anyone. So no, thank you very much. It was great fun.
Thank you for listening. You can follow and subscribe to The Bigger Picture wherever you get your podcasts. And to learn more about this episode or to reach out to us directly, please visit us at rcarter.com.